Kentucky Derby winner Sovereignty is skipping the Preakness. Stick around and find out what it means. Hi, everyone. Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets, here with breaking news about Sovereignty, your 151st Kentucky Derby winner skipping the Preakness Stakes. Now, before we get into this news and what it means for the Preakness moving forward, I want to make sure to remind you to press that like button and subscribe to NYRA Bets YouTube today. Subscribing is entirely free of cost, just notifies you when new videos drop on the channel, whether those are race previews, full card analyses, handicapping and betting tutorials, and so much more. Now, listen, we're going to have a lot of content for the Preakness, no matter who's running in it. So like I said, press that like and subscribe button today. All right. Well, listen, the breaking news coming out Monday afternoon that Sovereignty, your winner of the 2025 Kentucky Derby, trained by Bill Mott, is going to be skipping the Preakness Stakes and instead will be pointing towards the Belmont Stakes taking place at Saratoga in 5 weeks' time. Obviously, this is big news. The Derby winner skipping the Preakness is always notable. It has happened in recent years. You had Rich Strike skip a few years ago. Now, I would argue that horse was questionably managed, to be polite. And so there's a little bit of an asterisk there. The other time the horse skipped in recent years was Country House, who, of course, remember, won the Kentucky Derby via disqualification from Maximum Security. So, again, a little bit of an asterisk there. But the notable thing is Country House trained by Bill Mott, who, of course, is the trainer of Sovereignty. Mott has always had a long view of a horse's career. He's not going to jeopardize the long-term future and health of this horse to chase after something over a period of 5 weeks. Now, I understand fans could be frustrated by this. The Triple Crown is always something that gets people excited about the sport. Obviously, when Pharaoh did it, then Justified just a few years later, and it's always a possibility. And I feel like in recent years, we've not really had a horse that felt like a legitimate Triple Crown winner. Obviously, going back to 2020, that was the COVID year, and everything was a little out of sorts. Distances were changed, and venues were changed in terms of the timing of all of the races. And you just didn't necessarily have that same feel. 2019 was Country House and the DQ of Maximum Security. Again, a little bit of a different feel. You look at even what then happened in 2021, 2022, and 2023. Again, races where you felt like, maybe the winner wasn't necessarily the best horse in the race, or you didn't necessarily know whether or not a horse would move forward from those efforts, things like that. So it did feel like Sovereignty was a horse that had a lot of potential and certainly looked to be a horse that could potentially contend for a Triple Crown. There had always been a lot of hype around this horse going back to his 2-year-old season. And so he was a heavily anticipated horse. He ran a fantastic race. Nothing about the Kentucky Derby felt fluky at all. He earned a 102 Beyer speed figure. Journalism, who finished second, was your favorite and ran a big race and ran a 102. Baeza, who was one of the top choices and certainly one of the top contenders coming in, ran a really good race for third. So it felt very formful in some ways. But listen, the decision is skipping the Preakness. And what does this mean? Well, let's talk about it in a couple of ways. One, what does it mean for the Preakness? Then we'll talk about maybe what it means for Sovereignty, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it means for the sport at large. Now, in terms of skipping the Preakness, this does leave the Preakness field in a bit of a no man's land because none of the Derby horses have really committed to coming to the Preakness. The only Derby horse that has come out and committed at this point is American Promise by D. Wayne Lucas. Now, Lucas might actually be disappointed there's not an allowance race to run this horse in between now and the Preakness. I mean, he loves running his horses. He does it often. And he did this last year, if you remember, because he has Caldera in this year's race as well, but he's also sending American Promise. Now, if you remember last year, of course, he won with Seize the Gray. But remember, he also entered Just Steel, coming off a very poor performance in the Kentucky Derby to run in the Preakness. Well, he's doing the same thing with American Promise, who finished 16th and is now coming back on 2 weeks rest to run again in the Preakness. We'll see if he's able to run any better. He had a little bit of a troubled trip, but I've never been that big of a fan of that horse, and I think he needs certain conditions to win. But we'll see. Lucas's mentality of running horses often, this one was on the bench. American Promise was on the bench for about 7 weeks, which is a really long time for a Lucas horse not to run. So maybe wheeling back on 2 weeks rest after that long of a layoff might actually get the best version of him. So listen, that's a possibility. But outside of American Promise, there's a question mark around Sandman. Baeza's not going. None of the other major contenders are considering it other than potentially Journalism. Michael McCarthy's assistant trainer coming out today saying that he's going to work on the track on Wednesday. We'll see how he comes out of it, but he came out of the race in good order. If everything looks good on Wednesday, then they might make some sort of a decision at that point about whether or not to go to the Preakness. I think if you are the connections of journalism, Sovereignty skipping the Preakness certainly provides you an opportunity, because if you look at the rest of this field, there's not necessarily a lot to be scared of. And I think it also sets up a lot better for him. And honestly, that was one of the concerns I had about Sovereignty at the Preakness anyway, which is that Pimlico does not set up to closers. Now, forget about the tight turns of Pimlico, all right? It has a lot more to do with the fact that the track on big days is usually souped up for front-end speed, and that it's usually a very speed-favoring track. And so it's tough for horses coming from all the way in the back of the field to really get the job done. So a horse like Journalism that's a little bit more tactical and able to sit a little bit more of a mid-pack trip is probably a little bit more effective at a track like Pimlico, as opposed to Churchill Downs, where you can see those closers, and you also aren't going to get nearly as diabolical of a pace in the Preakness as you did in the Kentucky Derby. Now, that said, you still should have a little bit of pace because there's some interesting other horses that are going. River Thames, who, of course, qualified for the Kentucky Derby, finished second to Sovereignty in the Fountain of Youth, finished third in the Bluegrass. That horse is going for Todd Pletcher. You have Rodriguez, who, of course, also qualified for the Kentucky Derby, won the Wood Memorial, but scratched because of a minor foot bruise and is now going to be running in the Preakness. And so that's going to be a major speed factor early in the race. But that's another very nice horse, though Journalism has beaten Rodriguez before. So nothing that would scare Journalism away necessarily from going into the race. Then you have a horse like Clever Again for Steve Asmussen. This is an interesting horse. We're going to have a more in-depth analysis of the Preakness tomorrow. But listen, that's an interesting horse in that it's a horse that debuted as a 2-year-old in the spring at Keeneland, went to the bench for a long time, came back just recently, won the Hot Spring Stakes and beat Gaming, who finished third in the Pat Day Mile, beat that horse by 4 lengths last time out. So that's a pretty serious horse in the front end. You have a horse like Gosker, who won the Lexington, who's in strong consideration for it. So there's still a lot of very nice horses that are going to be running in the Preakness no matter what, but it does lose a little bit of star power, a little bit of pizzazz when the Derby winner skips. And obviously is going to be pointing toward the Belmont at Saratoga instead. That's also where Baeza is going to be potentially pointing also. And depending, we'll have to see what Journalism ends up doing for McCarthy. So it's going to be interesting to see how this changes the dynamics of the Preakness. Do some other horses in the Derby consider taking a shot now that Sovereignty's out? You know, does a horse like, let's say, Burnham Square decide, hey, I'll take a shot at coming to this race? Does, you know, like I said, Sandman was a little bit of a question mark. I don't like his chances at Pimlico, but would he potentially go? Would one of the front-end speed horses that might be a little bit better at a course like Pimlico, would East Avenue potentially come back and run back? Probably not, because Brendan Walsh has Gosker. I would have a hard time thinking he's going to run back East Avenue as well in that race and have 2 of his top horses run against each other. But he might. You know, a horse like Owen Almighty, as leg weary as he looked in the stretch, even though he held on for 5th, would he come back as a front-end speed possibility? We'll have to wait and see. So, you know, it certainly does put the Preakness into a little bit of a flux for the for this year in terms of what the field looks like and the major contenders coming into the race, and whether or not anybody else coming out of the Derby is going to really take a shot. Right now, it's, like I said, it's American Promise, maybe Sandman, maybe Journalism. If Journalism comes, it really does save the race in some ways, because that's a big name. That was the post-time favorite. That's a name a lot of people know. And that would certainly add that star power back into the race. And it would set up potentially a really fun Belmont if Journalism were to win the Preakness and go to the Belmont. Now you have the winner of the Preakness and the winner of the Kentucky Derby facing off against each other. That would be a potentially fun matchup to see as well. Now, what does this mean about the Belmont? Well, listen, it means that you're going to see the Kentucky Derby winner run at the Belmont at Saratoga, and that is going to be a lot of fun, obviously. You have the Peter Pan being run this week up here at Aqueduct. The winner of that race usually points towards the Belmont Stakes as well. There's some really interesting horses. I know Todd Pletcher's got one, Vassimo. Chad Brown's got a couple of horses. Actually, he's got one, Lordship, on the far outside, who's a little bit interesting. And then Hill Road, of course, as well. You got a horse like Captain Cook running in this race. He actually might have a huge pace advantage. We'll talk plenty about the Peter Pan later in the week. But listen, it's going to be an interesting dynamic to see who ends up going to the Belmont at Saratoga. Because, of course, remember this year, just like last year, the Belmont Stakes is a mile and a quarter. It's not the traditional mile and a half as when we had it at Belmont and what it will be when we go back to Belmont. Because it's at Saratoga, it has to be at a mile and a quarter. That, I know, upsets some old school racing fans who go, there's no way there was ever going to be a Triple Crown this year because the Belmont's not a mile and a half. That's the essence of the Triple Crown. That is the test of champions. It's a mile and a half. And when it's at a mile and a quarter, it can't possibly be the Triple Crown as a result, even if a horse wins all three. Fair enough. People are entitled to their opinions on those matters. I know my dad called me up at 8 o'clock in the morning to tell me this. So, listen, everybody has their opinions on this one. That said, by having it at a mile and a quarter, it invites a lot more horses into the race, I think, because a lot of trainers would probably look at the Belmont at a mile and a half and go, my horse can't do that. And so I think it will invite a fuller field, a more competitive field being at a mile and a quarter. While it's at Saratoga, it's also very obviously historic to run the Belmont Stakes at Saratoga. So we'll see what that means for 5 weeks from now. Now, what does this mean for the sport of horse racing in general? People are going to overreact because that's what people do. And yes, it's a big deal, but it's also not the end of the world. We've had other Kentucky Derby winners in recent years skip the Preakness, and people will say, oh, we need to change the Triple Crown format. I would say listen, if you want to change the Triple Crown format, go for it. I'm not going to stop you, although I think it's foolish, but I'm not going to stop you. And I've seen plenty of proposals out there from people who I have a lot of respect for. Some of those ideas are good. Some of those ideas are not particularly good. I won't go into the details of them. But the reality is that I think we in horse racing have a problem if we define ourselves as a sport by what happens with a collection of 23-year-old horses over a period of 5 weeks. Now, I know those are the biggest days that people watch, but there are tens of thousands of other horses running across the country throughout the year on turf, on dirt, on synthetic, going long, going short, doing a lot more than running a mile and a quarter, a mile and 3/16, a mile and a quarter, a mile and a half on the dirt. And I think this is actually one of the ways in which sometimes we miss the plot a little bit with horse racing. That when we define ourselves by the Triple Crown, and then we see a year like this year, where there was a record amount of money bet on the Triple Crown, on the Kentucky Derby. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the Netflix show had a massive effect in that regard. I think some of the connections definitely brought more attention to this race, particularly a horse like Sandman, who had Griffin Jackson, who is a very prominent influencer, and somebody who, I don't say that in a derogatory way at all, somebody who clearly cares about his horse a lot and really is invested in the sport and in the game, not just to get clicks or not just for engagement, but he's somebody who I think really has a bright future potentially in our sport, and I'm happy that he's a part of it. But, I think there's a lot of reasons why you saw a record amount of handle for the Kentucky Derby, and that was awesome. But again, the day after the Kentucky Derby, there's racing. The Monday after the Derby, there's racing. The Tuesday, there's racing. We need to think about how do we brand our sport across all of these days, not just minimize it to the 3 days on the racing calendar for these 3-year-old races on the dirt. So while I understand people think, oh my God, because the Derby horse skipped the Kentucky Derby or skipped the Preakness, it's the end of horse racing. No, it's not the end of horse racing. It's not necessarily even a problem in horse racing. It's a problem that we define ourselves by 3 days on the racing calendar. That's the problem, that we only have national relevance 3 days out of the year. That's the issue. And therefore, when we only define ourselves by 3 days out of the year, when a prominent horse skips one of those 3 days, then we feel like it's a Chicken Little situation and the sky is falling. If we perhaps, and let's really think outside of the box here, defined ourselves in a broader way and tried to engage fans in a broader context of racing, we would not be so hell-bent on being so tied to how we perform on those 3 days out of the year. Listen, those 3 days are always going to be the most important days in our sport. I get it. But to define ourselves like that, I think is a problem. And we just need to understand the Triple Crown is an incredibly difficult thing. And even if Sovereignty had run and lost, would that have made everything better? suddenly? Would that have saved racing if Sovereignty had run in the Preakness and lost? Probably not. Wouldn't have changed much at all. Now, listen, I feel bad for the people at the Preakness. They're going to have probably a little bit more of a challenge in terms of getting a lot of excitement and getting that handle up for them for their big day. No two ways about it. But like I said, if a horse like Journalism shows up, that's a big deal. And I think there's also this idea of maybe this Netflix show has just brought more eyeballs to the sport of horse racing, and not just for the Kentucky Derby, but just in general for all of these races. But again, we defined ourselves by these 3 days in the sport. There's a lot of other days in the sport we need to work on defining ourselves by. So for people who think this is somehow like we need to change the nature of the Triple Crown, and if we don't, somehow the sport is doomed, there's a lot of other reasons that there's problems in horse racing outside of when the Preakness is run relative to the Kentucky Derby. There's a lot of other reasons for that. That's a whole other episode. But the reality is that for today, the news is Sovereignty, your winner of the 151st Kentucky Derby, is skipping the Preakness Stakes. Will be targeting the Belmont Stakes at Saratoga next for trainer Bill Mott and ownership group Godolphin. And I think that's notable that Godolphin went along with this decision. They are the most powerful organization in our sport in terms of an ownership group. And if Godolphin trusts Bill Mott, which of course they do, he handled Cody's Wish, who was one of the great stories over the last 10 years in our sport. And if they trust Bill Mott, and there's no reason not to, then that really should tell you everything you need to know, that they're looking at the long-term health of this horse. And oh, by the way, let's remember the last 3 winners of the Kentucky Derby, Rich Strike, Mage, and Mystic Dan. Those 3 horses have combined for exactly 0 subsequent victories. So it's not as if we've been saving racing by running these horses more often, all right? And by running these horses back in the Preakness, and that's not somehow enhanced the level of the Triple Crown. Having good horses run for a while and develop fan bases, as we saw with a horse like Cody's Wish, who was a miler, admittedly, but that is how we start to grow the sport. That is how we start to bring people into it. So listen, Bill Mott making the decision to skip the Preakness obviously has a big impact on the Preakness field, changes the dynamics a little bit. There's a lot of front-end speed in the race with Rodriguez, with Clever Again, with River Thames, with Caldera potentially for Dwayne Lucas. Like those are all speed horses. And while the track does sustain speed, if Journalism decides to go, it certainly sets up for him pretty well. But like I said, I was always a little skeptical that Sovereignty would be able to win the Preakness. And I always felt that that was the toughest of the 3. If he had decided to run in all 3, this was always, in my opinion, going to be his toughest test because of the nature of that Pimlico track and the fact that it doesn't necessarily lend itself to deep closers doing well. So listen, stay tuned to NYRA Bets because we have a lot more content for you on the Preakness. We're going to have individual contender spotlights for all the horses that are running in the Preakness Stakes. We also are going to have a lot of content for the races coming up this weekend. We've got a big weekend of racing up here in New York in particular, the Ruffian, the Man of War. We got the Peter Pan, like I said, a lot of great racing taking place up here at Aqueduct during the Belmont at the Big A meet. So make sure to press that like and subscribe button today. All right. My name is Matthew DeSantis. Wish you a great and prosperous day at the races. And reminding you, friends, it's now post time.